Most people think a prison sentence is about time, years, months, decades, but in the world's most extreme prisons, time is not the punishment. The punishment is what happens to the human mind while time passes. Some prisons are not designed for rehabilitation. They are not designed for safety. They are designed to break people quietly, behind concrete walls, far from public view. And once someone enters these places, survival is no longer guaranteed, not because of escape attempts or riots, but because of what prolonged isolation, violence, and deprivation do to the brain. These are the worst prisons to be sentenced into. The American Supermax experiment in the United States. The most severe prison conditions are not found in chaotic cell blocks or overcrowded jails. They are found in total silence. The federal government's most secure prison, ADX Florence in Colorado, represents the extreme end of incarceration. Often called the Alcatraz of the Rockies, ADX Florence was designed to hold inmates considered too dangerous to be housed anywhere else. The structure is intentionally minimal. Each inmate is confined to a single concrete cell for up to 23 hours a day. The bed, desk, and stool are all made of concrete. Meals are eaten alone. Human contact is rare, brief, and often conducted through steel doors. The cells include narrow windows, but they are positioned to prevent inmates from seeing anything recognizable outside. No horizon, no mountains, no sense of place, only sky. Former prison officials have described the environment as clean and controlled. Psychologists have described it differently. Multiple studies have shown that extended solitary confinement leads to hallucinations, extreme anxiety, paranoia, memory loss, emotional breakdown. Inmates have reported losing track of days, months, and even years. Some forgot how to hold conversations. Others began speaking to themselves just to hear a human voice. Court records show that several inmates attempted suicide inside ADX Florence. Some succeeded. Despite this, the prison remains operational, because in the American system, control is often prioritized over consequence. When life sentences mean exactly that. Another prison frequently cited as one of the harshest in the United States is Angola Prison in Louisiana. Officially named the Louisiana State Penitentiary, Angola sits on over 18,000 acres, the size of a small city. It was built on the grounds of a former slave plantation. That history is impossible to ignore. More than 70% of inmates at Angola are serving life sentences, many without the possibility of parole. For decades, Angola had one of the highest rates of inmate-on-inmate violence in the country. Stabbings were common. Gangs controlled sections of the prison. Correctional oversight was minimal. At one point, Angola was referred to as the bloodiest prison in America. While reforms have reduced some violence, the core reality remains unchanged for most inmates. There is no release date, no countdown, no second chance. The sentence is not yours, it is existence. Former inmates and observers describe a psychological state known as permanent present. When freedom is impossible, the future stops mattering. And when the future stops mattering, behavior changes in dangerous ways. When prisons lose control entirely, not all of the world's worst prisons rely on isolation. Some rely on abandonment. In La Sabaneta prison in Venezuela, guards reportedly refused to enter large sections of the facility for years. The prison became self-governed. Inmates armed themselves with knives, firearms, and explosives smuggled inside. Entire cell blocks were controlled by gangs. Violence was constant and unpredictable. Bodies were sometimes left unattended. There was no consistent authority, no rules that applied equally. Human rights observers describe the prison as a war zone, not a correctional facility. In these environments, survival depends entirely on alliances, money, and reputation. Justice becomes informal, punishment becomes immediate, and the strongest rule. The psychology of extreme confinement. What connects the world's worst prisons is not geography. It is psychological damage. In environments of constant threat or isolation, the human brain adapts. But those adaptations come at a cost. Neuroscientists have found that prolonged exposure to extreme confinement can physically alter brain structure. Regions associated with emotional regulation shrink. Stress hormones remain elevated for years. The ability to process normal social interaction deteriorates. This damage does not end at release. Former inmates often experience chronic insomnia, hypervigilance, emotional detachment, social withdrawal. Some describe feeling more trapped outside prison than inside it, because freedom requires skills prison environments actively destroy. Why these prisons continue to exist despite mounting evidence of harm. The world's worst prisons remain open. Governments justify them using familiar language: public safety, deterrence, control. But critics argue that these institutions serve another function. They operate out of sight, behind walls the public never enters. And because the people inside are labeled as the worst, their suffering becomes easy to ignore, until it isn't. Lawsuits, leaked footage, whistleblower reports, again and again. The same question surfaces: at what point does punishment stop being justice? The real sentence in the most extreme prisons. The sentence is not the crime. It is what the environment turns a person into over time. Some never leave, some leave changed forever, and some leave physically free but mentally confined. And this is only the beginning. Because there are prisons where silence is constant, where violence is routine, and where the human body is treated as disposable. And those places are even worse. When people imagine the worst prisons, they often picture violence, riots, stabbings, chaos. But some of the most dangerous prisons in the world are not loud. They are quiet. Places where suffering happens slowly, behind locked doors, through neglect rather than force. And in these prisons, people don't just serve sentences. They disappear inside the system, when isolation becomes a weapon. Across the United States and other parts of the world, isolation has become one of the most powerful and controversial tools in modern incarceration. Solitary confinement was originally intended as a short-term measure for safety. In practice, it has become long-term punishment. Inmates in extreme isolation units can spend months, years, or even decades alone in a cell. Minimal human contact, no physical touch, little to no natural light, silence broken only by mechanical sounds. Psychological experts have repeatedly warned that the human brain is not built for this. When sensory input is removed, the mind begins to create its own. Hallucinations become common. Time perception collapses. Thoughts loop uncontrollably. In some U.S. supermax facilities, inmates have been held in solitary confinement for over 20 years. Human rights organizations have compared these conditions to psychological torture. Yet courts have often upheld them as lawful, because the damage they cause is invisible. Prisons, where medical care fails. Another defining feature of the world's worst prisons is medical neglect. In many systems, healthcare exists in name only. Staff shortages, underfunding, and bureaucratic delay turn treatable conditions into fatal ones. In several American state prisons, investigations have revealed patterns of inmates waiting weeks or months for medical attention, and, in some cases, symptoms were ignored until it was too late. Untreated infections, uncontrolled diabetes, mental health crises dismissed as misconduct. Incarceration removes personal autonomy. Inmates cannot seek second opinions. They cannot leave. They cannot refuse conditions. When care fails, they have nowhere to go. Internationally, the situation can be even worse. In some prisons, medication is unavailable entirely. In others, it must be purchased through bribery. Mental illness is punished rather than treated. As a result, prisons become warehouses for the sick, and survival depends less on sentence length than on physical resilience. When prisons turn into mass graves, some of the worst prisons in history are remembered not for their walls but for their death tolls. In certain regions, overcrowding reaches unimaginable levels. Cells designed for 10 people hold 50. Ventilation is non-existent. Disease spreads rapidly. Tuberculosis, skin infections, respiratory illnesses. In extreme cases, inmates sleep standing up. Sanitation collapses, and once disease takes hold, containment is nearly impossible. During outbreaks, lockdowns are imposed. Movement stops. Medical access decreases. Food distribution becomes irregular. In these conditions, death becomes routine, and because prisons operate behind closed doors, many deaths go unreported or are classified as natural causes. Prisons where violence is policy. Not all violence in prison is spontaneous. In some facilities, it is structural. When staff are understaffed, undertrained, or overwhelmed, control shifts. Gangs fill the vacuum. Rules become informal. Protection is transactional. Punishment is immediate. In these environments, violence is not an exception. It is how order is maintained. Inmate hierarchies determine access to food, space, and safety. Refusal to comply carries consequences. And because official oversight is limited, abuse becomes normalized. This form of violence is especially dangerous because it leaves no clear perpetrator. The system itself creates the conditions, the mental aftermath of extreme incarceration. The most lasting damage caused by the world's worst prisons often appears after release. Former inmates describe difficulty adjusting to normal life. Crowds trigger panic. Silence feels threatening. Routine social interactions feel overwhelming. Years spent under constant surveillance create lasting hypervigilance. Some struggle to make decisions without external control. Others report emotional numbness. Relationships suffer. Employment becomes difficult. Sleep is disrupted. Studies show that former inmates from extreme confinement environments face higher risks of depression, substance abuse, suicide. Freedom, in these cases, is incomplete because the prison remains internalized. Why reform is slow or doesn't happen. If the damage is so clear, why do these prisons continue to operate? The answer lies in distance. Most people will never see these facilities, never hear the daily routines, never witness the consequences. The populations inside are politically powerless, and public attention tends to focus on crimes, not conditions. Reform requires transparency. Transparency threatens institutions built on secrecy. As a result, change is incremental or non-existent. Even when reforms are introduced, the underlying structures often remain intact. Different policies, same environment. The final reality: the worst prisons in the world share a common truth. They do not fail by accident. They function exactly as designed, by isolating, by neglecting, by exhausting. And once someone enters these systems, survival depends on more than behavior. It depends on endurance, because in the most extreme prisons, the sentence does not end when the gate opens. It ends, if it ever does, inside the mind. There are prisons where the outcome is already decided. No rehabilitation plans, no long-term programming, no expectation of release. In these facilities, incarceration is not preparation for freedom. It is preparation for death, whether through execution, neglect, or time itself. The sentence is final and everyone inside knows it. These are the prisons where hope is systematically removed. The reality of death row in the United States. Death row exists as a separate world inside the prison system. Inmates sentenced to death are often housed in extreme isolation, sometimes more severe than supermax conditions. Cells are small, movement is restricted, contact is limited, and like standard incarceration, death row has no countdown that leads to freedom. Instead, time stretches indefinitely. Appeals can last decades. Some inmates spend 20, 30, even 40 years waiting for execution. This creates a psychological state unique to death row. The future exists but only as an unknown endpoint. Execution dates are scheduled, postponed, reinstated, and delayed again. This cycle has been described by psychologists as anticipatory trauma. The mind prepares repeatedly for death and is forced to survive afterward. Studies show that death row inmates experience elevated rates of severe depression, psychosis, emotional dissociation, and many cases. Mental illness worsens significantly after sentencing, yet mental health care on death row remains limited. Prisons built around execution. Some prisons are known not for who they hold but for what they do. Facilities like San Quentin State Prison in California have housed one of the largest death row populations in the Western Hemisphere. The condemned unit is physically separated from the rest of the prison. Narrow walkways, thick steel doors, constant surveillance. Cells are often smaller than standard housing. Movement is heavily controlled. For decades, San Quentin was the primary execution site for California. Although executions are currently halted, the infrastructure remains. Execution chambers do not disappear when they are unused. They wait. In other states, execution facilities are integrated directly into prison compounds. Inmates may live just yards away from where executions occur. This proximity creates a constant psychological presence of death. The system does not hide it, it normalizes it. An execution is not the end in some prison systems. Death is not swift. Inmates sentenced to death may spend years in deteriorating conditions before execution ever occurs. Aging populations on death row face chronic illness, mobility loss, and cognitive decline. Some become physically incapable of understanding their own sentence. Others develop dementia. This raises complex ethical questions. Can someone be executed if they no longer comprehend why? Courts have struggled with this issue. Meanwhile, inmates continue to age inside cells never designed for elderly care. In some cases, death row inmates die of natural causes before execution. The sentence is carried out indirectly. International death prisons outside the United States. Conditions surrounding death sentences can be even more severe. In Iran, Saudi Arabia, and China, executions are carried out at much higher rates than in the U.S. Transparency is limited. Legal representation is restricted. Appeals are rare. In some countries, inmates are not informed of their execution date in advance. They are taken from their cells without warning. The lack of certainty becomes part of the punishment. In Bang Kwang prison in Thailand, death row inmates were historically shackled continuously. Leg irons remained on for years. Only days before execution were they removed. Cells were overcrowded. Sanitation was minimal. Food was scarce. The environment reinforced the message. Survival was temporary. When prisons become sites of disappearance in some prison systems, death sentences are not formalized. People simply vanish. In authoritarian states, political prisoners are often held in facilities that operate outside judicial oversight. No public records, no trial transparency, no confirmed sentences. Families are not notified of deaths. Bodies are not returned. These prisons function as tools of erasure. The absence of information is intentional, and fear extends beyond the walls. The role of time in final sentences. Time behaves differently in death-focused prisons. Days are measured not by routine but by uncertainty. Noise becomes significant. Silence becomes unbearable. Small changes, a delayed meal, a locked door, carry enormous psychological weight. The mind remains in a constant state of anticipation. This sustained stress has measurable physical effects: elevated heart rates, weakened immune systems, accelerated aging. In some cases, death row inmates exhibit physical decline similar to people decades older. The body prepares for death even when it does not arrive. Why these prisons still operate? Despite global debate, prisons built around death continue to exist. Governments argue deterrence, closure, justice. But critics argue that these systems often reflect political pressure rather than proven effectiveness. Studies have failed to conclusively show that the death penalty reduces violent crime. What is clear is the cost: financial, psychological, moral. Yet dismantling these systems requires confronting deeply embedded beliefs about punishment, and that confrontation is slow. The final destination of incarceration, the worst prisons in the world, reveals something uncomfortable. They show what happens when punishment is pushed to its extreme, when confinement becomes erasure, when justice becomes irreversible, when the system no longer plans for survival. In these places, the sentence is not about correction, it is about conclusion, and whether through execution, neglect, or time itself, the outcome is the same.